All right, so today we're tackling a question that sparked a lot of debate. Did the U.S., after breaking free from one empire, become an empire itself?
It's a question with no easy answers, that's for sure.
Yeah, and we'll be digging into it using excerpts from 19, American Empire. It's from the American Yawp, which is a collaborative history text, always evolving and changing.
It's a really interesting approach to history.
Yeah, definitely. And for this deep dive, we're focusing specifically on the decades that followed the Civil War. That's when America, well, started to really flex its muscles on the world stage, you could say.
It's a period of dramatic transformation, both domestically and in terms of America's global ambitions.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that even before 1898, which we'll get to later, the U.S. was already involved in global affairs, right?
Yeah, that's a key point. We often think of 1898 as a turning point, but the U.S. was already deeply engaged, especially in places like China, the Pacific, and Latin America.
So these early interventions, they sort of set the stage for what was to come.
Precisely. They reveal a growing American assertiveness on the world stage.
I'm curious about these pre-1898 interventions. You mentioned China. What was happening there?
Well, American businesses, they saw huge potential in China. Vast markets, lots of opportunities for trade. This led to the open door policy in 1899, demanding, at least on the surface, equal access for all Western powers to Chinese trade.
Sounds fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, but in practice, it was also a way for the U.S. to assert its own economic dominance in the region. Kind of like, sure, the door is open, but we're holding the keys.
So it was about influence as much as access.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about economics either. Think back to the Boxer Rebellion in 1900.
Oh, right, that uprising against foreign influence.
Exactly. And the U.S. joined an international force to suppress that rebellion. What's really interesting here is that this intervention set a precedent for presidents using military force, sometimes even without, getting explicit approval from Congress.
That's a pretty significant precedent to set. It's like a subtle shift from diplomacy to more direct military action.
It is a subtle shift, and one that, becomes increasingly important as we go through this period. Now, if we look at the Pacific, there's an even earlier example of American expansion, the Guano Islands Act of 1856.
Okay, gotta admit, not familiar with that one. Guano, that's a...
Guano is, well, bird droppings. And in the 19th century, believe it or not, it was a really valuable fertilizer.
Huh. So this act allowed Americans to just claim any island with guano deposits. For the U.S., I mean.
Yep, that's right. Might seem insignificant, but it really established a legal framework for claiming territory, no matter how small. It doesn't even have to be, strategically important or anything.
So bird droppings as a stepping stone to empire. Who knew?
It's an early example of what some historians call manifest destiny, this idea that the U.S. was destined to expand. And you can see how, something like the Guano Islands Act kind of paves the way for a growing appetite for expansion, so to speak.
Yeah, dipping their toes into the water of imperialism.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about guano. American missionaries were spreading their influence throughout the Pacific, too, especially in places like Hawaii.
Right, bringing religion and, well, American culture to these far-off places.
That was the idea, but it often got intertwined with business interests, too. Missionaries, they acquired land, established plantations, ended up wielding a lot of power in some cases.
It's almost like a blend of religion, economics, and power dynamics all mixed together.
Very complex, very much so. Now, shifting gears to Latin America, we see a similar pattern. During Porfirio Diaz's rule, American investment in Mexico, it was huge, really massive.
And then, boom, the Mexican Revolution in 1910, right? Throws a wrench in things.
It certainly did. And that's where Woodrow Wilson comes in. He wasn't exactly known for a hands-off approach to foreign policy.
No, not at all.
His interventionist approach led to some pretty serious conflicts. Figures like Victoriano Huerta and Pancho Villa, they become key players in this story. These events really highlight how intertwined economic interests and military force had become in American foreign policy.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how all these seemingly disparate events, China, Guano, Mexico, they all point in the same direction.
They do. It was all part of a bigger story about a growing American willingness to exert its power and influence on the world stage.
A story that will keep unraveling as we move forward. Okay, so America's making its presence known globally. But like you said earlier, 1898, that's the real turning point, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It really is. You've got the Spanish-American War, which really pushes the U.S. onto the center stage, in terms of global power. And then almost immediately after, the Philippine-American War. And that one really forces Americans to confront, the realities, the ethical complexities of, well, becoming an empire.
So let's take those one at a time, starting with the Spanish-American War. What was it that actually pulled the U.S. into this conflict?
Well, Cuba, they were fighting for independence from Spain, and there were these reports circulating in the U.S., often, well, sensationalized by the press, about Spanish atrocities, against the Cuban people.
Yeah, this is where we see that yellow journalism, right?
Yeah,
I mean, shaping public opinion.
it definitely played a role. Yeah, those sensationalized headlines, exaggerated accounts, all of that. And then you have the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. Still debated what the actual cause was, but, well, it became a rallying cry for
I
war.
remember the Maine. Still powerful, even now. But I think, wasn't McKinley hesitant to go to war at first?
He was, yeah, he really understood the risks involved. But I mean, he's also dealing with this mounting public pressure, Congress pushing for
So
action.
it was a real mix of events and politics, that ultimately
Yeah,
pushed the U.S. into war.
it was, yeah, a complex situation.
Okay, so then what about the war itself? The source mentions it was short, decisive victory for the U.S.
It was, yeah. I mean, the U.S. military, they'd modernized quite a bit since the Civil War. Turned out to be a very, very formidable force. End result, the U.S. gains Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, significantly expands America's reach, globally.
Right, right. And those territorial acquisitions, especially the Philippines. Well, that leads us straight to the second major conflict of 1898, the
Yes.
Philippine-American War. And that one's, well, it's just fraught with ethical issues, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It was brutal, a very, very bloody conflict. I mean, it forces Americans to look in the mirror a bit, to really think about their actions.
Uh-huh.
The Filipinos initially, they were allied with the U.S., right, against Spain, but then they end up fighting against, well, the people who were supposed to be their liberators.
So looking back at those pre-1898 actions, was the Spanish-American War, I don't know, was it bound to happen? Or was it really a big change for the U.S.? I mean, it seems like there was more going on than just, liberating Cuba.
Yeah, it's a tough question. It really is. I mean, you can see how the U.S., they were already showing they were willing to get involved in other countries' affairs, but this was a big step, for sure. Taking these overseas territories marks, I don't know, a new chapter in American foreign policy. And I mean, the debate about whether this was like the start of American imperialism, it goes on.
And the Filipinos fighting a guerrilla war against this huge force. I mean, they must have faced incredible challenges.
They did. It was grueling. It really was.
Yeah.
Challenging terrain, and they had to rely on guerrilla tactics. It went on for years, this war.
Yeah.
A lot of casualties on both sides.
So did the U.S., I don't know, betray the Filipinos? Or were their intentions always, different from what the Filipinos believed?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Historians are still arguing about it today. Some say the U.S., they never intended to grant the Philippines full independence. The whole, talk about liberation, that was just, I don't know, a cover for imperial ambitions. Others argue that it started with, I don't know, maybe good intentions, but then the war, the realities of governing a distant territory. Things got messy, but I mean, the impact, it was lasting, no matter what the intentions were. Shaped U.S.-Filipino relations for decades after.
A reminder that war, it has a human cost. And that, ambitions, they can have unintended consequences. So we're moving into the 20th century, and there's one figure that really embodies this era of American expansion, of power, Theodore Roosevelt.
Can't talk about this era without talking about Roosevelt. Veteran of the Spanish-American War, strong advocate for American power, for expansion, big believer in a strong navy. I mean, he was really influenced by Alfred Thayer Mahan's ideas about naval power, shaping global politics.
His presidency from 1901 to 1909, that's when we see this big stick diplomacy, right?
That's right. Military strength, assertive diplomacy, all rolled into one. Major expansion of the U.S. Navy. Symbolized, I guess you could say, by the Great White Fleet. This fleet of battleships, they sailed around the world, showcasing American naval power.
Sending a clear message, right, with those ships.
Yeah. Don't mess with the U.S., basically. It was a real arrival, America as a global force.
Mm.
But Roosevelt's vision, it wasn't just about military strength. He was also focused on, well, the Western Hemisphere. And that's where the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine comes in.
The Monroe Doctrine, that was established way back in 1823, warned European powers, to stay out of the Americas.
Yeah.
So the Roosevelt corollary, it builds on that, right?
It does. It takes it a step further. Issued in 1904, asserts the right of the U.S. to intervene, in the domestic affairs of Latin American nations. The idea was to maintain order, stability, but it basically claims U.S. dominance over the region.
So it's not just about protecting them from Europe anymore. It's about the U.S. as the big power in the hemisphere.
You could definitely interpret it that way, yeah. Roosevelt, his argument was that the U.S. had a responsibility to intervene, in cases of, I think he called it chronic wrongdoing by Latin American nations. So it kind of justifies interventionism as a way to prevent Europe from getting involved.
So far, this picture of American foreign policy, it's very male-dominated, isn't it?
Yeah.
But what about women? I mean, were they just watching all this happen?
Not at all. Women, they were really involved in this whole debate about imperialism on both sides, too, for and against U.S. expansion, shaping public opinion, promoting American values abroad, advocating for social justice back home.
I'm curious about those opposing viewpoints. I mean, were there groups,
Yeah.
specific movements?
There were. The Anti-Imperialist League, for example, included some big names, Jane Addams, Josephine Shaw Lowell. They campaigned against U.S. expansion. Their argument was that imperialism, it betrayed American ideals, self-determination, all of that. And they worried it would just entangle the U.S. in, unnecessary foreign conflicts.
So a practical problem, they thought.
Right. They thought the U.S., they should be focusing on domestic issues, promoting peace, not, getting involved in military adventures abroad.
What about the women who supported expansion? What was driving them?
Well, a lot of them, they believed in this idea of the civilizing mission of the United States. They felt that American culture, especially as, I don't know, embodied by white, middle-class Christian women, it had this positive role to play, uplifting, modernizing other nations.
The civilizing mission, I mean, it's loaded, right? Ripe for misinterpretation.
It was, and it was often used to justify, imposing American values, cultural norms on other societies. And I mean, the reality was way more complicated, of course. The idea of a civilizing mission, it often got tangled up with economic motives, a desire for power, all of that.
So it's this mix of idealism and self-interest. Hard to separate the two.
Yeah, and to make things even more complicated, this is all happening while there's this massive wave of immigration to the U.S. I mean, huge.
So you've got, on the one hand, this surge in American power, and on the other hand, this huge wave of immigration. Did everyday Americans see a connection between the two?
That's a really important question. It gets to the heart of, how Americans saw their own national identity at the turn of the century. I mean, for many, these two trends, imperialism, immigration, they weren't separate at all, kind of intertwined. Both, in a way, raise questions about what it meant to be American, with everything changing so fast.
Yeah, you're talking about a period like between 1870 and 1920, something like over 25 million immigrants came to the U.S. That's a huge number of people, all these different cultures.
It is unprecedented, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, Asia too. And, well, this wave of new immigrants, they were different from earlier waves, I mean. And their arrival, it triggered this nativist backlash, concerns about, jobs, competition, the culture changing.
It seems like these worries about immigration, they pop up again and again in American history.
They do. And it wasn't just, talk. It led to real policy changes, most notably the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882.
Yeah, that's often seen as a real turning point in U.S. immigration policy. What made it so significant?
Well, it was driven by, there was definitely racial prejudice, but also worries about labor. The act basically banned Chinese immigration to the U.S., and it was the first law that really restricted immigration like that, based on, race or nationality.
A pretty dark moment in U.S. history. And it didn't stop there, did it?
No.
Yeah.
Sadly, it didn't. After the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were more laws, more restrictions, expanded the categories of, who was considered undesirable. Shows this growing anxiety, I think, about assimilation, about, what it meant to be American.
The source, it mentions Catholic immigrants specifically. Was their experience different?
Well, the Catholic population, it was growing really fast. A lot of immigrants were coming from Catholic countries, and this led to, anti-Catholic sentiment among the, Protestant majority.
Oh.
They were suspicious.
And within the Catholic community itself, were there divisions?
Oh, yeah. Big debates about how to integrate into American society. Some people, they pushed for rapid assimilation, drop your language, your customs, all of that. Others, they wanted to hold on to their heritage, keep a distinct Catholic identity.
So even within one group, lots of different ideas about what it meant to be American.
Exactly. It's complicated. Assimilation, trying to find a balance between your old life and your new life.
Well, we've covered a lot. America before 1898, then 1898 itself, the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, then there's Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, women on both sides of the imperialism debate, and this massive wave of immigration. And the reactions to it, it's a really complex story.
Yeah.
It makes you think about America's role in the world and about, what it means to be American.
It really is, and it's important to wrestle with that complexity, to understand, how we got to where we are today.
So big picture, what should our listeners take away from all this?
I think one thing is that, American imperialism, it wasn't just about, military power or taking territory. It was about economics, culture, ideas, about spreading, American values and influence. And it's impossible to separate it from, the things happening within the U.S., concerns about national identity, all that, especially with globalization happening so fast.
Wow. Foreign policy and domestic issues, they're all connected.
Exactly. And, when we're looking back at history, it's good to remember that decisions made then, they still affect us now. How we relate to the world, how we see ourselves.
That's something to think about.
Yeah.
How do those legacies of American expansion, how do they play into the debates we're having today about immigration, about global power, about American values?
It's a question we all need to think about. History doesn't give us, easy answers, but it does help us understand, where we are now and maybe help us make better choices in the future.
It's not just about the past, is it? It's about now. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us into this really fascinating, sometimes difficult part of American history.
It's been a pleasure.
And to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep learning,